My name's Jason Appleby. I'm a 34-year-old gay man who was infected with HIV in 2000. I found out I was hepatitis C positive in 2009. I was tested for hepatitis C quite regularly. Around, mid-2000s, I think we started to become aware of sexually transmitted hepatitis C. So it was something that was in, I guess, the back of my brain that was happening to HIV positive gay men. That said, finding out I became positive, or that I became hepatitis C positive in 2009, made me, I was quite alarmed by it, to the point where I felt the need for instinctive action. So I raced to find out more about treatment and what it might mean. I raced to find out what my best options for treatment were. I raced to a hepatology specialist and everything like that. In a sense, I found it quite a galvanizing experience. Finding out I was hepatitis C positive in 2009 kind of galvanized me in a sense. I was a bit alarmed by it. I knew a little bit about the implications of treatment, so I guess I kind of raced to find out more, to find out what my best odds of managing treatment were, I guess trying to bargain my way through how could I avoid a longer term of more harsh treatment, if it was better to wait for better treatment options. I knew that treatment at that time was at a liminal place. There were better options in the pipeline, but was it better to strike now or wait a little bit later? I think I was quite defensive about my infection. I think the reason for that is that there was still a fair amount of resistance to the notion that hepatitis C was sexually transmitted. So I think particularly around, in the HIV medical sector, there's a fair amount of stigma around hepatitis C, which leads to the assumption that it must have been acquired through intravenous drug use. And in fact, it seemed like that resistance continued on even after there were other identified cases of sexually transmitted hepatitis C. So in my mind, I felt the need to be more defensive around that, particularly with some of my clinical, or some of my healthcare providers and some of the people in my immediate, work sector, than I would have necessarily with friends or other support. I felt the need to kind of justify my hepatitis status in a strange way. I think that people bring their own assumptions on hepatitis C and how it's transmitted according to their own experiences. So for some hepatologists who deal with a broad sector of the community, their experience of hepatitis C may actually be those people who acquired it through blood transfusions. For people who tend to work with intravenous drug users, then they'll tend to assume that that's what it all comes from. I think that in gay community and in the clinicians who service the gay community, particularly the HIV sector, there's been an unwillingness to allow the notion that it may well have been sexually transmitted. And I think part of that is because there's a fairly higher level of intravenous drug use in the gay community anyway, and particularly amongst HIV positive gay men. So it allowed for people to hold on to certain beliefs or assumptions, which maintained a stigma for longer than it was perhaps useful. I think some HIV positive gay men are certainly leaping to that understanding, perhaps faster than their clinicians are. I'm certainly seeing a lot more HIV positive gay men concerned around the sexual transmission of hepatitis C, to the point where I'm seeing HIV positive gay men saying that they don't want to have sex with men who are HIV positive but who may well be hepatitis C positive. So it's an interesting, another element of sexual selection, I guess, not unlike what happened in the 80s and 90s and 2000 with people who are HIV negative not wanting to sleep with people who are HIV positive. Whether that belief or those series of assumptions are being taken up by the broader medical community, I can't really speak to.
Now, the treatment itself, you were explaining, you went through an initial diagnosis and treatment process. Take me through that.
One of the things that became readily apparent for me when I became hepatitis C positive was that there were two things that were true. The first thing that was true was that people who are HIV positive tended to have slightly worse treatment outcomes, that success was slightly less likely. The other thing that was true was that the earlier people treated, like if you treated an acute infection, the more likely you were to have a successful outcome. In addition, if you treated earlier an infection, if you treated during acute infection, treatment duration was lessened. So for me, it became a very easy calculus to determine, well, if I start treatment now, it's only going to be for 24 weeks and I've got better odds. And I can always wait and see how my markers are at week 4 or week 8 before determining whether to proceed. Whereas if I wait till I'm in a better headspace perhaps, then it's going to be a longer course of treatment with worse odds. So it made sense for me to jump into that treatment thing at that time. I was a bit naive in a sense. I think intellectually knowing what all those words mean that are the side effects can be can be useful. It can allow you to reason your way into something. And to a certain extent as well, my experience being a HIV positive gay man, I've lived a lot with side effects. I've been HIV positive since 2000. My first antiretroviral cocktail was in 2000. It was quite a grueling experience as well. So I knew I could live with side effects. I guess the opportunity of those percentages that were presented made a forceful argument for me to, I guess, start treatment at that time. One of the things that struck me before I initially started treatment was that I looked a lot at various resources that were made for people who are hepatitis C positive around starting treatment, and particularly some of the peer-based stuff. And one thing that struck me, there were a couple of very clear messages that kind of came through those resources. And the first was that treatment was difficult but not impossible, that support from other people was essential, I guess, to a success. But the other thing that kind of struck me was this narrative of difficulty, that people were more likely to share their negative experiences. And often, I think some of these resources were aimed at people who weren't working. So the only obligation they had was necessarily to get treatment done. And it seemed like finishing treatment became the key priority in people's lives who started treatment. When I was looking at me beginning treatment, that wasn't an option. I still had to work. I had friendships and relationships that I needed to sustain, and also that I would have needed to sustain me. In fact, whilst maintaining treatment was a very important part of my journey, it was actually maintaining treatment in the context of living the rest of my life as much as I could. To that end, the support of other people became essential. Even if that support was an understanding that if you weren't part of something that was mission critical, which was getting me to work in the morning, getting me home from work in the morning, or taking my medication, then you could wait for 6 months until I came out the other side. And some of the support that I got from friends was the notion that they'd just see me out on the other side. Whereas other friends were there to help keep me company or help get me to bits and pieces. And that became kind of the background support. I'd say I wouldn't have been able to finish treatment without that level of support, and having queued it up in advance was a very sensible thing. But I guess the other thing I'd say is that for me, treatment was both better than I expected and worse than I feared. Some of the worst side effects of treatment that people reported I found quite easy to negotiate. The stuff that I found most grueling was stuff that people didn't seem to mention. Things like, for me, sleep didn't seem to work so well, and the ongoing, I guess, psychiatric trauma presented by the interferon, this notion that this cumulative effect of misery and despair, that even as you were getting closer to the end of treatment, it seemed that much further away. Those things I found really difficult to quantify or experience. Things like anemia and other things like that I found quite easy to change my life around. The thing that made it most difficult was that, at every point along my treatment journey, I wouldn't have kept going if all the odds weren't in my favour. And so they do a blood test 3 months after you finish treatment, and that was fine. And they still do one at 6 months after treatment, but it's generally accepted that if you're fine at 3 months, you're going to be fine at 6 months. And so I felt a bit poorly 4 months in fact, had a bit of jaundice and kind of dreaded the worst. But it was, I guess, a rational dread. So to find out that I was Hep C positive again 5 months after I finished treatment, it was a bit of a kick. I had to sit there and wonder, well, why did I go through this? And the clear answer is I did it because I had to do it. I would have felt terrible if I hadn't tried anything. The fact that there's some benefit with my viral load is a good thing. But if I look at my original motivations for going on treatment in the first place, which is to try and prevent the onward transmission of hepatitis C, then I haven't really gotten there. I know that there are new treatment options in the pipeline, and I'll wait for one that doesn't have interferon again and that works with what I'm doing in my life and everything else. But I'm kind of in this in-between space now where I'm not particularly prepared to engage with my hepatitis C again as a health condition. It's not pressing. It takes a long time to really go anywhere. I've got time to spare. So it kind of sits in the back of my brain, because otherwise I think to think about it, I'd be incredibly disappointed and hurt again. I felt quite comfortable disclosing my hepatitis C status after I found out initially that I was infected, and then I was on treatment. So I didn't really need to disclose to anybody because I was busy undergoing treatment, and it wasn't like there was any particular settings where it was necessary or relevant. The period of time after I cleared, when people spoke about hepatitis C, I spoke about my particular journey in clearing hepatitis C. And now I guess I disclose in contexts where other people talk about it. When I see that people choose to, don't want to have sex with people who are hepatitis C positive, well, I just remove myself from that setting without necessarily disclosing. it's really interesting for me because I disclose my my HIV status, like fully upfront in almost every context, but hepatitis C is something that I'm still kind of struggling to work out how and when to disclose. I don't keep it a secret by any means, but I don't volunteer it in the same way that I do my HIV status. Why do I think I treat hepatitis C disclosure differently to HIV? Part of it is, I think, the stigma associated with it in the context within which I might share that information. So whilst I think HIV positive gay men have a growing understanding of hepatitis C being sexually transmitted, I think it also carries that junkie stigma that's associated with intravenous drug use. Ironically enough, I think these HIV positive gay men, a larger proportion of them may actually use intravenous drugs, but I think that there's this inner belief sometimes that gay men can't be junkies even if they use intravenous drugs. The other part of my hepatitis C status and disclosure is that there's only so many things you can disclose and only so many things you can be honest about all the time. There's an exhaustion to things. I don't know how much more I can present up front without just keeping a wall between me and the world, and that's sometimes what it feels like. I actually don't think I jumped in too quickly. I actually think the calculus of a shorter treatment time with greater efficacy is something to aim for if your life's in that place. I think that foolish would be the healthcare provider who thinks that they could force me into doing something that I don't want to do. And I suspect at certain points in that first couple of months after infection, I was perhaps running forward with the bit between my teeth. But so powerful is the need to try and gain control that we want to rush forward and do things. I know that that's not the same for everybody else. I know that some people really feel an intense pressure to go onto treatment regardless of where their life's at. And whilst I think that the medical support structure around hepatitis C treatment is fairly honest around the implications of treatment and the necessity to go on to treatment and how useful it can be, I think that there's an empty space where we're helping people identify whether or not they're ready for treatment it's an empty space. There's yet to be a conversation there or a prepared checklist. Do you have these things in order? If you have all 5, then yes, maybe you should consider treatment. If you don't, well, here's how you get this one and here's how you get this one. Be that financial income support or help getting to all your appointments, or do you have good sleep hygiene, all of those bits and pieces that you want to have first before you start treatment. You don't want to be halfway through and then trying to kind of change course. I find discussions of preventing onward transmission, particularly in the setting that I'm in, incredibly challenging. And I guess that comes down to, I identify more as a HIV positive gay man who has sex with other HIV positive gay men. And in that setting, condoms, I'm zero-sorting in that reason, so I don't need to use condoms. We talk about the sexual transmission of hepatitis C, but we don't necessarily give a clear or evidence-based prevention message, like what am I supposed to do or how are other people supposed to protect themselves? We talk about condom use, but we don't necessarily know that they work. More to the point, if I disclose my status to someone who's hepatitis C negative, is a condom really necessary if I'm not having sex for 12 hours on drugs, this, that, or the other? There's a lot of uncertainty. It does make me incredibly anxious. But I find that, once again, it's one of those empty spaces where I think a little bit more robust conversation has to occur that isn't just risk averse and kind of knee-jerk reaction stuff.